Hi, I'm Megan Morelli, Community Relations Specialist for Forefront Credit Union. We are so excited to partner with the National Writer Series as this season's community investment sponsor. We hope you enjoyed tonight's event featuring Dax-Devlon Ross's Letters to My White Male Friends.
Good evening and welcome to the National Writers Series. I'm Jillian Manning, the Executive Director here at NWS, and I'm so pleased to introduce our guest for tonight, Dax-Devlon Ross. Dax has led a career as an educator, nonprofit executive, equity consultant, and a journalist with a focus on social justice. His newest book, Letters to My White Male Friends, blends memoir, U.S. history, and call to action, culminating in a unique addition to our country's conversation on race. Now, I'm not a white male, but this book really resonated with me. It's a book for anybody who has begun or is thinking of starting their journey of anti-racism, who wants to work toward justice and positive change in their workplace, community, or home. Dax's letters are thoughtful, honest, and powerful, and I came away from each chapter with a new perspective. This is a book that calls you in rather than calling you out, and no matter where you are or what your background is like, you'll find places to learn and connect. Our guest host for tonight's conversation is Courtney Wiggins from Northern Michigan E3, previously known as the Anti-Racism Task Force. Courtney is a founding member of E3, which works to eradicate racism and build a regional movement toward racial justice and collective liberation through education, elevation, and engagement. We look forward to spending the coming hour with you for this important conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dax-Devlon Ross and Courtney Wiggins.
Good evening, everyone. Before I get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I currently reside on. I am here in so-called Traverse City, Michigan, the rightful place of the Anishinaabe people. Much gratitude to the ancestors of this land and those who follow in their footsteps. It is an honor and a privilege to live here on these lands. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, my name is Courtney Wiggins, and I am a member of Northern Michigan E3. Our mission is to eradicate racism and build a regional movement toward racial justice and collective liberation through engagement, education, and elevation that is BIPOC-led and BIPOC-centered. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dax-Devlon Ross, who is an author of 5 books, who's had a career as an educator, a nonprofit executive, and a journalist with a focus on social justice, and also an equity consultant. He has done many great things. I will let him tell you more about that. But one of the things that I think is so amazing is that he's doing this equity work with Dax-Dev and Third Settlement. And the mission of Third Settlement is forging a story and dialogue to build bridges in a fractured world. and using context to do that in story building. And I think that that's really amazing. It seems like that's really important to you, Dax. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Courtney, for being here tonight. Thank you for saying yes and agreeing just to moderate this conversation. I want to thank Jillian and Carl and the whole NWS team for putting this amazing event together and inviting me to be a part of it. It's really an honor. So you raised this question to me about context. And one of the things that I talk about a lot and that shows up in the book, and the book is actually patterned after and really situated within, is context. And so to do that, I want to start off this experience with everybody tonight. First of all, hi, is everybody doing? Good to see everybody. By sharing a little bit about myself, my story a little bit. So there's a picture that we're gonna show you some pictures and we'll talk through some of them. But there's an initial picture I want to start with, which is from my high school graduation. And this is a picture of my father, me, my little brother. And I've always thought of this picture, which is now so many years old. Don't even need to tell you, but it's so many years old. My father's he passed away several years ago now. But he's central to the book in many ways. He's a central figure to this book, even though he was not around for a lot of the book. But a big part of that story with that image for me was that he wasn't smiling. And I always wondered why my dad wasn't smiling. Here I was graduating from this esteemed high school, off to college, done all the things that I was supposed to do. And he stands there steadfastly, arms behind his back. Some of it probably has to do with his military background, but some of it is just something else is going on there. So we'll move forward. I want to kind of move forward by moving backwards. We're going to look at the next slide and kind of begin to tell the story. My father grew up in Richmond, Virginia. He grew up in the Jim Crow South. He grew up at a time in which education was segregated, much more as well. And so this was the part of the country in red that he was raised in the 1940s and 1950s. And we can slide forward to the next slide. My father is also the exact same age as Emmett Till, the boy who was at the age of 14 lynched in Mississippi. And if some of you may not know this, but Emmett Till's parents wanted his image to be seen, the image of his mangled little body to be seen. And so they actually had the image published in Jet magazine. And while I never talked to my father about this explicitly, I have to imagine that at 14 years old, if him to see this image or to know of this image and to imagine that this could have been me, in all of his life having known that that could have been him. So he moved forward a little bit farther. My father grows up at a time and period in the United States, and we're still having these conversations quite clearly about voting rights. But he grows up at a time which in Virginia, literacy tests were being used to keep Black people like his parents and his uncles and his aunts and his grandparents and his cousins, keeping them from being able to vote. They also were using poll taxes to keep them from voting and registering to vote. This is his milieu, what he's growing up in. We go a little bit further. But my father has the good fortune of testing well enough to get into the University of Virginia. But because the University of Virginia found out that he was Black, they actually paid for him to go to Howard University, the Mecca. Of course, Howard has been in the news in the last 48 hours. If any of you have been tracking, you've heard about the incredibly important hires of Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates. But my father graduated, and this image right here is him graduating from college in 1964, very important. May 1964, he graduates from college. He's the head of his class, president of the engineering school at Howard University. We can go forward. Later that same summer, civil rights legislation passes. This is huge. He is the direct beneficiary of the passage of the civil rights law. He is the direct beneficiary of opportunities, doors that are opened up. He couldn't have arrived at a better time in terms of his own elevation and opportunity. But we move forward. So I want to pause for a moment. I'm not going to actually make you take this quiz, but I want to read these questions out because they're important. So first of all, and just you can answer for yourself. This is just a kind of a pop quiz. Laws restricting hunting to certain regions and to a specific time of year were passed chiefly to prevent people from endangering their lives by hunting, keeping our forests more beautiful, raising funds from the sale of hunting licenses, preventing complete destruction of certain kinds of animals, preserving certain game for eating purposes. You decide. You decide. The next one is the statement, the saying, straight trees are the first to be felled, means most nearly, honest effort is always rewarded, the best are the first chosen, ill luck passes no one by, the highest in the rank have the furthest to fall, or E, the stubborn are soon broken. Again, decide for yourself what you think might be the right answer. And then finally, we have the third of the questions. Although the types of buildings in ghetto areas vary from one-story shack to the large tenement building, they are alike in that they are all drab, unsanitary, in disrepair, and often structurally unsound. The quotation best supports the statement that all buildings in ghetto areas are overcrowded, undesirable as living quarters, well-constructed, about to be torn down, seldom inspected. We can move forward. Next slide. So these are actual questions that were placed on a test called Test 21. And Test 2021 stood at the heart of a 1976 Supreme Court case, Washington versus Davis, in which two Black applicants for the Washington, D.C. police force, again, Washington, D.C. at the time was predominantly Black, they were applying to become police officers. In this test, over a 3-year period, it was demonstrated that Black applicants failed the test at a significantly higher rate than whites. So 2 Black applicants filed this lawsuit. The issue at stake was whether a race-neutral policy, that is Test 21, which had questions about trees falling in the woods, hunting licenses, and ghetto buildings, whether that policy violates the 14th Amendment, if it yields racially discriminatory effects or outcomes. The ruling, very important, that the 7-2 ruling, and the only 2 justices Marshall and Brennan, who always sided together in over 2,100 cases, I write about it in the book. The ruling, nevertheless, is that a plaintiff must prove a perpetrator's intent in order for discrimination claim to be considered valid and actionable. I know I'm a lawyer, I'm not gonna get too hyper-technical with you. This is an important case though, because it sets the stage for what is to come over the next 20 to 30 years, specifically because that rationale, that principle becomes both a bulwark and a barrier to being able to address racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. So we move forward in the next slide. So I am this kid growing up as this is happening, and I write about this throughout the book, as I'm growing up in this so-called post-civil rights world. I'm attending schools, integrated schools. We can move forward to the next slide. I have my soccer team. This is my neighborhood soccer team. You can see the images of my classmate, my soccer team. You know, we have a very diverse team once again, you know, and then we move forward once more. So we see my Sidwell Friends basketball team. I write about basketball team. And again, you see who we are, how we show up. So this is all happening in the 1980s and early 1990s, while the decision that I just told you about is wreaking havoc. So we move forward finally to the next slide. And what we see here is that if you can almost pinpoint it, when you start to see the rise in incarceration in America, and of course, the significant portion of those are African-American and also just men of color more broadly, and also women of color. I point all this out to you because it is important to understand context. That decision, that Washington v. Davis decision, was instrumental, significant in creating many of the tensions that we have right now in America when we talk about racism. We have some people who talk about systemic racism. And what I just demonstrated, hopefully to you, was that here you have a test that while it does not appear to be racist, it very clearly has cultural implications. And there's knowledge that people from certain cultures might have better access to. It is producing results. But we can't get underneath that because the Supreme Court has already said that the only way you can prove discrimination is if you can prove that it was intentional. This has a huge impact. We move forward. It is 2 slides and I'm gonna stop after this, and thank you for being patient and listening to me. So, continuous backdrop, 1992. This is a year before I'm graduating from from high school. And that year is the year that Rodney King's, the 3 officers that beat Rodney King and that all of us saw video footage of. This was like the first time this also was visibilized. And you can imagine the trauma of myself, my friends, all of us watching this happen and understanding that this has to be justice that's going to be done around this, and for it not to be carried out in 1992. So we go to that last picture. We're going to end up here. So we come back here. And so when we begin to understand why my father is not smiling in this picture, we understand, I understand at least, that his life is in many ways bookended by the harm to Black bodies, Black male bodies, and the fear and the anxiety and the concern that it will happen to me as well. So I offer all that to you by way of context, as a way to think about and understand and maybe even enter the book that we're going to talk about. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dax. So that's a lot. That's a lot to hold.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a lot. And that's not just you. There's a lot of us that are holding this weight. So you break the book down into 3 parts: harm, heal, and act.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that it flows like that. Can you talk about why you chose to write the book in that way?
Yeah. You know, what occurred to me last summer when I had the opportunity to write this book, which was on the heels of George Floyd's murder and also on the heels of a letter that I wrote in response to a number of phone calls I was receiving from my white friends about how I was doing. What I noticed was this desire to act, this desire to do something, this desire to what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And I found myself sitting with that and asking, well, why now do you feel the need to act? And what makes you think you have the skills, the competencies to do action and with right intention and right outcome? If you didn't have it a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and you weren't motivated and you hadn't done the work, why now should you be trusted to just act?
Mm.
So my invitation, my offering was to go through this journey with me on this book. Not a long book, but I do need you to do some work before you just go out and start to act. Because acting can be harmful, it can be reckless, it can be without awareness. So I wanted to situate an understanding around a journey that would start with recognizing the harm. Because quite often, and I say this a lot when I talk about this book, we talk about harm as if it only affects people of color, the harm of racism. We do not have a language and a literacy to talk about the harm that is enacted on white people as a result of racism. White people often can't really construct, what is it, what do you mean, Dax, that I've experienced harm? You know, and it's funny, I talk about it in the book quite often, and I'm gonna get back to the structuring, but I do have a slight segue. Last night, and I didn't see this live, but I read about it this morning, Ta-Nehisi Coates was on, I think he was on MSNBC, the Joy Reid show, and he said something that I thought was really powerful, and I just wanted to share it back because it does really get to this idea of harm that I'm really trying to grapple with in the book. He says that, you know, what people don't understand about Nicole Hannah-Jones not going to North Carolina to teach there, while it's a boon and it's a benefit to the students of Howard, it's a harm, a loss to the students at North Carolina. Mm. There's harm that has been done not only to the Black students there, but to the white students, because you will not have access to a brilliant person.
Yes.
And what we need to start to do is understand when we have these folks in power who always want to move the ball, who want to change the rules when it's inconvenient for them or when they don't like what the outcome is that you are doing harm. And it's not just to the person to whom you think you're doing harm to your own children, your own grandchildren, because you're depriving them of something. So I wanted people to get in touch with the harm. And in fact, my own experience at Sidwell, and I talk about my experience at this private school, this elite independent school that I have deep love for, but also have a deeply conflicted relationship with, was that one of the realizations that I had as I wrote the book was that from the time I left public elementary school to the time I was a senior in college, I did not have a Black woman teacher. I did not have, and so that harm was to me, but it was also to my classmates, because it meant you never experienced someone in a position of authority, expertise, talking to you, sharing with you, giving you the richness of their experience and of their knowledge. And it can form beliefs in your mind about who is competent, who should be a leader. And that's a harm that can be done to you. So that was the harm part. And then the healing part was about largely my own journey towards coming to some better understanding of, through my professional journey, like, why is this? What is this thing that I have been socialized into? Because my journey was my own, of course, but I believe that it can be illustrative, and it can be an invitation and an opportunity for others to do their own work. So as I think about and talk about the harms that I experienced, I want my readers to stop and pause and reflect and think about your own journey, and do the same thing around the healing experience, because before you can act, you've got to start some healing work. You got to understand how you've been impacted by this, not just intellectually, right? And it's not just going to be books that you can read to grapple with that. So that's the reason for the three distinct parts. And then the act is like, if you made it through, now you get to talk about action. But I need to work through the other, but I need you to do that work first.
Yeah, I hear that. I oftentimes think about the word choices and when people use certain words, and how dialogue is really a powerful tool. And how do we talk about these topics in a way that brings people in and isn't divisive?
Yeah.
And I think you do this really well in using the word friend.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering that was intentional to use friend.
Yeah.
In your title and in every change throughout the book.
Yeah.
You address everyone as friend.
Yeah.
Instead of calling people out, you're calling people in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you call them forward.
Yeah.
You're calling people forward. A friend of mine taught me that word recently. It's like, hey, I like that one too. I'm gonna borrow that one too. That's because that's what happens in this work, is that it's a mix, and where you expose yourself to new terms, new words. It's always an ever unfolding journey. But the word friend, in many ways, there's both a conscious and an unconscious response to that question. I'll start with the unconscious. I didn't really think about it, but until afterwards, I was like, well, some of this book is situated around my experience in the Quaker education journey. And in the Quaker experience, we regard one another as friends. So that word friend is salient and resonant in that world. But in the other vein, like in the more conscious vein, I recognize a couple things. And I've said this in sort of the ways in which I talk about it. There are people who are going to look at this book, and the title of the book alone will piss them off. It will piss them off.
Yes.
Who does this Black man think he is? How dare he try to write a letter to me? What does he know about anything about my experience? And also the feeling of, this idea of lumping all white people together in a conversation about race. If it resonates with you, you will pick this book. And you will find, as Jillian pointed out, even in the introduction, that while it's targeting very intentionally white men, and even more specifically white men who hold positional and economic and all other manner of power in this society, because I genuinely feel like we don't have enough of a direct conversation with white men in power and who hold power. It gets obscured. There's often this, we don't directly negotiate and talk in these ways that are important. And so I wanted that to happen, but I also needed, for my own sort of equanimity, my own my own sort of my own ability to write this, was that I actually have a lot of friends, a lot of white male friends, people who I'm in close proximity with through my middle school years, high school years, college years, law school years, all the various points of my life. I said to, I think Carl wrote this beautiful piece the other day, and I really appreciated Carl for writing the piece that he wrote in My North, but he captured a quote, and at least a portion of the quote where I talk about, if you had 25 of my friends here, I would probably say, any 25 group, if I had a group of 25 friends, I would say, 10, 12 of them would be, my closest friends would be white men. And that's a real thing for me. And the reality is sometimes I haven't had these conversations with them because I didn't want to fracture the friendship. But what I've learned and realized is that the only way we're truly friends is if we can talk about this stuff. Otherwise, we're just acquaintances.
Right. And the more we talk about these things, there's a better understanding between us and a recognition, and it flows outwardly to other people that we come in contact with.
Yeah.
And that's really important. That's right. That is incredibly important.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now it is I have to be really honest. Like, I sometimes felt as though I do not want people to misread the book as like, I'm letting people off the hook, or I'm not having the hard conversation. Because I feel like there's a hard conversation happening here. I feel like I make some very, very pointed observations and calls to action in this book. And I also recognize and name the fact that for me, the work I'm up to in the world isn't about just removing people and canceling folks. It's about finding a way for us to be in proximity and relationship with one another that's authentic. Meaning that I get to show up and I get to tell you my truth, and I get to name it, and you don't just get to dismiss it because it's coming from a Black person and you decided that I'm not fully an American or not American like you. Therefore, the truth that I offer is not a valid truth. I need us to not be able, we need to be able to acknowledge the fact that our journey here, my role here, my relationship to this land, and I'm glad, and I appreciate the land acknowledgement that you did at the beginning, but my relationship to this land at this point is true as your relationship to this land. So you don't get to tell me, that what is and what is not. We get to be in conversation about it, and I get to bring some facts to the table too. And you can't just dismiss those facts because you don't like them, because they're inconvenient, right? But we got to do that. And what my commitment is, I'm going to stay in the conversation with you. I'm going to do the work with you, but we're not going to be in an abusive role relationship. We're not going to be in a space where we can't have this sort of a real honest reckoning around what is true. Like, what we know to be true is that there's a Black wealth and Black and white wealth divide in this country that is no different than it was 50 years ago. That is the truth. We got to deal with that. That's not just by accident. There are choices that were intentionally have been made to maintain that. And whenever we consciously don't make choices, we don't undo stuff, policy systems, we're allowing it to move forward another generation. We're kicking the can down the curb and allowing the next generation to do the work that we need to get done.
Do you find that when you are in conversation with your friends, that a lot of times they want you to show them statistics on things to back things up? Like, your experience isn't enough.
Yeah.
I need to have proof.
Yeah. And what I will say is that I know it because I've also experienced it, and I've done it myself. I went through that same educational experience, which prioritizes a kind of rational, sort of reason-based approach that uses a form of data and a form of typically quantitative data, because even qualitative data is not typically, it can be dismissed or it can be disputed, uses a form of quantitative data for all explanations and for justifications. And that can be used as a means of, I think data can be a powerful tool, but data is agnostic. It's not the data is something that can be manipulated and can be used in a variety of ways. So what I do entertain and engage in my own work as a journalist, as a writer. I have an affinity for using information and trying to get people sourcing, because I think that's valid. And I also say in the book, in a chapter that's specifically about disbelief, like, we need to start believing people. You got to stop needing 10 times for it to be verified multiple times. You need to stop questioning and thinking, well, this is a specific time, this particular instance. No, this is a pattern. And we've been telling you it's a pattern. It has been happening. Because you've decided to hear it now does not mean it's just happened now. and it's uncomfortable, yeah, but the disbelief only requires us, it only keeps us from doing the sort of real and important work of dismantling and rebuilding. So yeah, like I do feel like I have to do that work sometimes for people, and my friends do sometimes, but I find less so. To be quite honest, I find less so in the last year or so. But there is, there's much more of an inclination to listen to somebody who has letters behind their name,
Yeah, absolutely.
I have JDEDF or whatever it is, I'm somehow automatically imbued with X, Y, and Z, when in fact we know they're organic. I call them organic intellectuals, people who have done their own work, who have taken it upon themselves, and maybe they didn't go through a conventional path to get that particular piece of paper, but they are more, they can say they have more insightful than me. They have more sort of understanding of history than I do. And I've encountered these people. And yet, because they haven't done it inside the sort of institutional structures that have been, in many ways, the only sort of validating, systems that we have in our society, they get easily dismissed. And quite often, those are people of color. Quite often, those bodies that those folks are inside of are bodies that don't show up, as white straight appearing white men, and therefore they get dismissed or their work gets undermined or discredited. Nicole Hannah Jones.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The work is somehow less valid, or it's biased, or it's clearly it's agenda oriented. There's a sort of privileging of objectivity. Even as a journalist, I know that every journalist enters a piece of work with some perspective. This notion of pure objectivity, we have to sort of really, really interrogate it. We live in a world where we're all influenced by all sorts of data, all sorts of experiences. So to presume that one is coming to a story with sort of cool, distant objectivity, I would prefer that you kind of tell me who you are and then let me go on the journey with you, and then I will decide, versus you present to me that, oh, this is objective truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, when this dismissiveness happens for us as people of color, us as Black people navigating in this world, there comes, and I don't know if this is true for you, but for me, I've had a lot of imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I write about that a little bit in the book. For those who don't know, maybe I'm not familiar with the term imposter syndrome, it can show up in any number of ways, but ostensibly it's the notion that one might arrive in a position, one might arrive and find themselves in a room that they didn't expect it for themselves to be, or people who look like them are not often in, and automatically people begin to doubt themselves. Like, I can't possibly be, they're going to find out. And when they find out, therefore, this notion that even though I've done everything to be here, somehow I'm still not of this place. And that's a deep, deep thing. And for me, I didn't have language to understand that. And that's what's so, as a young person navigating this stuff in middle and high school, there is no one sitting me down beforehand. So Dax, you're going to experience this thing called imposter syndrome. And so I want you to navigate it. That doesn't happen, right? There was no terminology for it. What I sat with was that just the sort of really unsettling and silencing sense that it didn't belong, or that if I spoke and said the wrong thing, it would confirm the fact that I don't belong here. And this is a weight that I think a lot of, especially in a racialized society like ours, we don't really take into consideration what it means to be one of only, or the only. That kind of weight of like, why me? Because you knew smart people in your community. You knew all these other brilliant folks. How did I make it? Why? That weight is heavy. And it's a psychological, I call it, we have limited cognitive bandwidth, and it requires cognitive bandwidth for people of color to navigate predominantly white spaces where they have historically been excluded. And that's bandwidth I don't get to use on whatever else. I have to use it to be thoughtful and considering how white people are going to be thinking about me in this moment. Like right now, even in this conversation, I'm like, wow, I'm having a conversation and I'm wondering what these white people are thinking about me out there,
Yeah,
Is
I
that a
hear
really good
that.
title? I don't know. I hope they think, but that's something that we have to navigate and be able to find ways to laugh about too, and find some element of humor in, because otherwise it can be crushing. And so part of what I've been able to do and what's helpful and been healthy for me is to find some way to create levity in the certain moments when there's when there's heaviness.
What tools do you use to create that levity?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I have the sort of the built-in tool of a 2-year-old daughter. You know, that's a built-in daily tool of like laughter and levity. But I think also just surrounding myself with people who have either been doing the work that I've been doing or have had similar experiences, because therefore we can laugh about it together. We can say, we could talk about the ridiculousness of certain things and the absurdity of things that we experience, because otherwise without an outlet, it kind of just spins around in your own brain. But just the confirmation of somebody else who's like, you had that experience too? Word. Woo, I'm not crazy. It's a powerful, so that alone is beautiful. And then, that's why it says a lot that some of the greatest humorists in our country, of course, have been Black folks, right? Because what have we done is we find ways to take that thing and turn it into something different that we call humor, but it is social commentary of often the ridiculous and absurd life that we are living here in this country, that is being mediated through something as, seemingly barbaric as skin differential. Like, yes, my pigmentation is different, but that does not therefore mean that I'm less intelligent, less all these other things. But I have to understand that I live in a society where there's a whole sort of edifice that has been built to diminish my dignity, to diminish my intelligence, to diminish my humanity. Whether it's phrenology in the 19th century, whether it was, all sorts of, bizarre stuff happening with testing of Black bodies in the 20th century. Like, there's a whole history of the ways in which we have been, we have needed to be dehumanized in order for white folks in America to feel humanized,
Absolutely. You talk a little bit in the book about being at Sidwell and having to go into remedial math for no good reason whatsoever. There was no reason.
My dad was an engineer. Like, whatever math you got to finish it, he's done it. This is an assumption that I needed as soon as I came into this predominantly white school. The assumption as a baseline is that he needs to do the slowest math. And it's a very unconscious sort of decision that gets made. And we see it continue to play out in education systems across America today. So absolutely, that was a very humiliating experience to sit in. I remember it's the sting of it in 7th grade. Like, why am I in here? Why are all my classmates going over there and I'm being pushed over here? And someone's telling me it's for my own benefit, which is often the kind of terminology that I hear white liberals use to kind of justify what can be considered do-gooderism on my behalf. Not taking into consideration that I actually had excelled in math, had already been promoted twice before. I was 2 years ahead of in my math courses before I got to the school. So, it was a hard, but it was a good attuning moment for me, because then I begin to develop the muscle to understand and how to begin to advocate for self.
Yeah, and you also had this again perpetuated with physics going into biology. And I'm curious if this was something that pushed you towards wanting to become an educator yourself, having experienced these things in the past, not having Black teachers in school. What was it that brought you to want to be in education?
Well, I want to qualify. I did at Sidwell, I had 2 really important Black male teachers, and I had Black coaches, but I just there were no Black women in that.
Right.
That's a really important part. But I just wanted to sort of make sure that's clear, because they were, 2 history teachers were very important for me. And I would say that those two gentlemen were very important, and for me to think about my own self. I think education, it sort of called to me before more than I called to it. I came to it. What I found was in my early 20s, I had an ability to connect with young people, and I had a passion for books, and I wanted to be able to share that passion for books with them. And I think that was the gravitational pull. If anything, in high school and in middle school, when those kind of experiences happened for me, where I had teachers who kind of made decisions on my behalf, what it did was actually push me further into sports. Because what ends up happening in those kind of experiences, that you go where you feel like you can be, you're getting positive affirmation. And so if in that academic environment, I was feeling as though I was not getting the positive affirmation, it was, I'm going to go where I can find and where people are giving me some support. And I think that's what often happens with particularly young Black men. It's like, you go where people both have already set you up to think that you're supposed to be successful. And then you go which any young person will do, you go where you're loved and you feel seen, And so that was part of it. And I do feel like if I were to talk to those teachers who made those decisions, I would love for them to understand the impact that it had on me. Like you set a bar, you decided on your own without anybody else in the room where you thought I belonged, and you thought it was for my own benefit. And that to me feels like a real travesty, a miscarriage of your role as an educator. Let me fail on my own. You don't determine that for me. Let me define and decide how I can fly. So.
Yeah, I hear that. It seems like decisions get made for Black folks, for people of color, quite often without consideration to our thoughts and feelings. And you bring that up many times in the book. Towards the end, also when you're calling people to action.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit, about how we as Black people, we as people of color, should be brought to the table when decisions are made or sought out.
I think I've had the benefit of doing some really interesting work in the equity space. And some of the work I get to do is like around survey. I do a lot of survey work, focus group work, where I'm able to just sort of like some analytics, and one of the questions that I'm really always interested in and really get at is decision making, how it shows up in organizational culture, because to me, that is a site for the place in which real harm can be done and where exclusion happens and where inequity gets perpetuated. So people talk about these words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They talk about them as one and the same. And I always try to help people disaggregate. Diversity is about representation. It's about how do we get more people who are from different backgrounds and different experiences. But inclusion is about the feeling, the experience of, do I feel like my whole self is being represented in this space? But equity is about, to what extent do the systems we have reflect fairness? And that fairness has to really take into consideration history, and sometimes the fact of there being a history of unfairness. And decision-making, information sharing is another one, but decision-making is like a really important site for how and to what extent an organization is really going about disruptive change. You can do cosmetic work on diversity. You can bring in people of color and you can tell yourself you're making some changes, but equity is really about our folks being brought in, particularly folks who are going to be impacted by a decision, who are going to have to live a decision out, whose jobs or livelihoods will be impacted. Are they being not just taken into consideration in a very generic way, but are they being sought out, included, brought in, and asked, and then also listened to, right? That's what folks are asking for. And not just like, please don't just ask me for more feedback if you're not going to listen to my feedback. There's feedback. Right. Don't just come and say, we got their feedback and then we decided to do what we we're going to do anyway, right? It actually means, if you're really committed to it, it's like, I heard these folks, I hear where they're coming from, and I respect what they're looking for, and I'm actually going to make a decision that's in line with those values, right? That's what we're talking about, where equity is and equity lives, and when you're really trying to get at that work. So decision-making is really critical in that space, and why I want folks to really think about, what are your systems for decision-making? Because quite often people do not have really transparent or accountable systems for decision making. People go in a room where certain people, there's a meeting after a meeting, or any number of things. And I think what I'm seeing in the work I'm doing is that people of color know that. They know that now. They know that quite often there's a decision after the decision, or a meeting after the meeting, where the real decision gets made, right? And there's
Right.
the push they're having, and the push that's happening right now is we got to break that up. We got to change that, right? So that's why decision making is such a critical piece of the work.
Thank you for that distinction. And also, within that, oh no, I lost the thought. Shoot. I'll come back to it.
Cool.
But we've got some questions here. We've got some folks with some questions, so I'm going to pull that up.
I love it. And thank you folks for being here. Thanks for hanging in there with us and just being part of this conversation. And I'm looking forward to answer some of these questions.
So we have Judy, who asks, did you remain in remedial math, or were you able to go into the correct class? If so, who advocated for you?
So, there were a couple experiences. I don't want to give too much of the book away because it's about the book, but I will just say that it was an ongoing process around more broadly my education. And I had multiple advocates. My parents at times, I have an older sister who was a really big advocate, who was she was race conscious before it was cool, and she saw things and she would speak up, because I wasn't always the one who was willing to do it, because I wasn't always one who wanted to rock the boat. I just wanted, I was just a kid, and I wanted to just have kid experiences and just fit in like everybody else. And so I wasn't comfortable always asserting authority in those spaces, but I will say, I navigated through some of the situations. And I'm just going to tell you, got to read the book to get a little bit more of that insight. But I appreciate the question, though. Thank you for that question, Judy.
We have a question from Aaron, who says, tell us about your experiences concerning Black voices in journalism. How does a lack of representation or equity in media affect the messages we all receive?
Oh my goodness. One of the most, I remember last summer, I think it was the Philadelphia Inquirer. It was a big sort of brouhaha there, because the editors there decided to do a headline that was, I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was like all buildings matter too. It was like they actually took this and they decided to, like, it was in the middle of the movement, a lot of things happening, and they ran a headline that was like all buildings matter, like a kind of a play on, but really sort of an expropriation of Black Lives Matter, which we see happening all the time, which happens with Black culture quite often, frankly, the expropriation without credit, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek manner. But what happened was that the journalists of color, and I'm sure some of their allies, organized themselves and wrote this scathing letter to the editorial team that really explored some of the pain that they've experienced, and that was pain that I could definitely identify with, meaning, there's everything from the assumption that Black journalists can't write long form journalism. And I've heard leading editors make those kinds of claims. There's a sense that there's only a certain number of people that can write a 10,000 word piece that's really going to be, and it's always predominantly white men, right? And we hear this stuff. We know this goes, or what kinds of assignments that you're given, or even the assumption that all I even want to write about is the criminal justice system, So like if I just want to write a piece that becomes, not as, it's like, that's not my experience, or somehow I'm better situated to write these kinds of stories. And those are important stories, and I'm grateful to be able to write them, but I also want to be able to do a variety of things. Like I would like to be able to write my next book and not necessarily be about race, as a matter of fact, like this isn't like the thing I'm trying to just do forever. I mean, I think it's an important work to do, but like, I'd like to be able to explore other things too, but this is important right now. And I want to be in this conversation right now. But I think as Black journalists, it starts from the very beginning, from, who gets who can take on an internship, and it's been really important. Like the Ida B. Wells Foundation is a group of journalists who've organized themselves to really create opportunities for Black and brown journalists, investigative reporters particularly. So there are journalists, and then there's the investigative journal, and then there's the embedded journalist, and who gets to be an international reporter, who gets to do all of that stuff. And we see who gets to go abroad and be embedded and be in wherever it is across doing the most high profile work? It's quite often a white man, you know?
Right.
And that's where we kind of developed a sort of customary acceptance of that is the way it's supposed to be. And what I think Black journalists of color are doing now are challenging a couple of things, both obviously sort of the paradigm of who can tell stories, but also how stories can be told and should be told. Because in that letter, I was referencing the Philadelphia Inquirer letter, some of the things that they talked about was even the sense that and I talked about it earlier, the way in which journalism in many respects has oriented itself and named and sort of its orthodoxy is in many ways problematic insofar as it can sort of not just rely on certain tropes, but it can exclude certain narratives that are important to being able to give folks in proper context, you know, because that can be seen as too much commentary, right? And it's not giving, but for a journalist, for myself, I can't just tell you that story. I need to tell you the why, give you the backstory. I need to give you more, because I don't want you to walk away from this story thinking that, you know, that without a deeper understanding of the whys behind it. So I think there's a real, and we saw in the New York Times, a number of newsrooms are going through some sort of seismic changes around not just who's in the room, but also how we tell stories and who gets to decide what a not just what a good story is, but what is a proper role of a journalist and journalism role, and what is it supposed to do and be about. And that's an important dialogue. You know, it's a really important dialogue, and I'm glad that I in some way get to be a part of it. But it's long overdue. You know, it's long overdue. But again, I think the last thing I'll just say is that, you know, this is, you know, I came to New York, and I like to tell this story because it's, you know, I came to New York after finishing law school with all this debt. And my first job was actually working in a nonprofit publishing house I worked in the mailroom. So I'm with a law degree working in the mailroom, making $15 a day. And I was paid in books. That's how I got that's what they paid me with. And, you know, I did that I did it for a couple of months with the hope and the aspiration that I would get an opportunity to get a foothold in the publishing world, you know, as an editorial assistant, knowing the pay was terrible, but I was like, I want to work in this field. And I'll never forget, you know, there was a job I went up for and I was competing against someone else, and the editor who was hiring brought me into a room and said, I remember the way the sun was shining that day. And she looked at me and she says, you know, I think you have a different trajectory. And I was like, so you know my future. You know what I want. You know what she was really saying is, I'm uncomfortable with you sitting outside of my office as my assistant. So I'm going to choose someone else who I'm more comfortable with. Even though I had been there working in the mailroom, been writing reviews, doing all sorts of things, had this background, blah, 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 it still wasn't enough. And that happens in publishing, it happens in journalism, it happens in these very important roles, in these spaces where ideas are born. Where ideas who gets to decide what book get published, what article runs, where it runs. Those are the kinds of decisions that are so critical, and they push people like me out of the field. Now, I fought to find my way back in as a writer, you know, but that was a fight, and it's consistently a fight.
Yeah. Do you ever see, or have you ever seen the bar is set incredibly high for you, or, you know, us as Black folks, and you just keep trying to get to that goalpost, and it keeps getting moved.
Yeah.
In comes someone who is white, and somehow the level is set differently.
I mean, I think it's a really important conversation. And again, I think about some of the work that I'm doing with organizations and companies. I think a real tension that I'm seeing inside organizations is around that very issue of how people get promoted, how folks get advanced. And there are, whether or not it's true, whether it's in someone's head, and part of the problem is that quite often even people get data that tells them this is how people are experiencing the workplace. Leaders can often deny that or find some way to disbelieve what's being told to them about people's actual experiences. But what I find in many of the organizations I've had an opportunity to work with is that is a pattern that people are observing. There's a pattern that, you know, in order for me as a person of color to move forward, I have to be sort of, you know, exceptional in all ways And I have encountered other folks, kind of white folks, who maybe have not had to have the same sort of, the bar has not been the same for them to move forward. And they can point to specific evidence. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that that's the pattern all places, all ways, all times. I think, though, that we have such a fractured history such as we have, and we have people who are walking with wounds, real wounds, that there's a predisposition to see things, feel things very deeply. And I think it's just our job to listen and be aware and take those folks' concerns seriously. So if I am saying this to you as an employee of your company, that I feel like there's a double standard, don't just dismiss it because you think I'm just a jaded and disgruntled employee. Actually take it into consideration, because there could be some truth to it. You know, in my own life, I don't know. I have a hunch. I don't have factual, I'm not going to say, but I have a sense, and I've known experiences and felt as though, yes, I've had to move and jump through certain hurdles, and I've had things be a little bit more difficult at times. And I also know that's part of a tradition too. And there's a tradition that I come through, and there's an ancestry that I link to, and I find that I'm going to find a way. And that maybe the case should be that I don't have to just I shouldn't have to find a way. I should just be able to show up, be whole, be good enough, and make it as that. But that's not what we are.
Right. Yeah. So we have a question from Kevin, and it is, in many ways, I think we are all wondering what the other is thinking of us. I think that leads to fear of conflict. Can someone do the work, see you as fully human, as a fellow human, and adamantly disagree with you about what is true? Do you see a possibility for a dialectical progress where both parties are wrong and find a new truth together? Or is there just a discourse based on ongoing difference, right, wrong, and an individual epistemology where we just agree to hold our own disparate truths?
I mean, that's a hell of a question. This idea. Yeah. So I think what I can speak to is my own personal experience with I have some relationships that have become more strained in the past year. And they've been with a couple of my white male friends where we just we just don't go there in certain places. We've had, and some of it's because we just don't need to over text. Like it just needs to actually, and we haven't been in person with one another, so we can't actually do the thing that needs to be done. And where this only gets worse over some of these mediums, like the social mediums that we're operating against and using, they can often devolve. I think there's also this element of, and part of what I think people may be responding to in the book is, the way I try to frame my own journey is through a recognition, and with a recognition that I also have had to go through my own awakenings and will continue to go through awakenings. You know, I am not a finished product. You know, I am someone who is continuously growing and evolving and developing more of an awareness of my own blind spots, my own gaps. You know, and part of what I'm trying to do in this conversation with people is use some of my experiences, recognizing the moments or having it brought to my attention the moments when there were gaps, and how I rather than just shrink from those moments or get defensive purely in those moments, try to use those moments as learning opportunities. But what's germane to that, fundamental to that, is that you actually have a real relationship with people in place first. So a real relationship can sustain. So if we think about our circles of influence, and if you think about, you know, you can typically have a hard conversation with a parent or with someone a loved one, and the relationship doesn't completely just shatter and end. That's because there's something there to hold it together. So the question becomes, to me, the extent to which you actually have something to hold it together before you decide to engage in that fraught thing. But I think that, you know, I try to model what it means to be on a learning journey in my work and in my writing and how I show up in the world, which is to say that I am open to and willing to engage in a learning process where there's going to be things that are brought to my attention, insights that I have and that I gain that will help, and this is my word, nobody use it, help me complexify my understanding of the world. So I unfortunately do think, though, that we're not in that place as a nation. I think people are really, really holding steadfast to their sense of their belief on all sides of these conversations. And there's a sort of real difficulty or an unwillingness to come together towards some kind of, deeper engagement in learning. I think people on this call, though, are doing that work. They said, you've listened to me for an hour, maybe say some things that you disagree with, or maybe you have a different opinion on, but you've stayed in the conversation. So that's modeling right there that we can do that, right? And I think we need to see more modeling of that happen. But, I think the jury is still out and it remains to be seen. But I do think that as people have, as doomsday sayers have said, this is a fight for democracy right now, however broken or however fractured, however qualified our democracy is, it is a fight for that. It is a struggle for that. And our inability to really navigate this stuff together it's going to continue to be a part of the undoing of what we're seeing right now. People isolating themselves, self quarantining, if you will, in their own sort of information silos, because it's easy, it's comfortable. And for white people, if you think about, like, I always say that as a Black person, and this is something that people maybe heard me say when I talked about it on NPR, like, as a Black person, I have to navigate white spaces. Mm-hmm. Like, there's just not a reality that I can have where I can just sort of choose only if I want, I have to, the majority of the people I'm interacting with. And so therefore, for me to become and to do these things, my navigation is essential, but for white people, it's often a choice.
Right.
I want to or not. And what I have to say is that you have to stop thinking of it as a choice, right? It's like, if you keep thinking it as an option, I might deal with Black people today. I don't know if I feel like it. As long as you think of it that way, then it's never going to really, the stakes are never going to be really meaningful and real. They're always going to be sort of like, when I'm comfortable, when it's convenient for me, when I'm ready to do it, rather than it's an imperative. And I say there's a difference between something being mandatory and it being an imperative. Mandatory means like, imperative means like, we need this. This is existential. This is who we are and what we're up to, what our children are going to experience.
Yeah. I think too, a lot of times when white folks are like confronted with that choice, a lot of times it's too late. And I don't mean like they can't come around, but it's there now. I hate using that, but like, yeah. Now I have a Black person here, so now I have to do this. There isn't a choice. Yeah. And I don't know.
Well, what I get at, what I hear in that is, and what I think is important is that, like, anything that we care about, we practice and prepare for. So that when that moment happens, we're not in a reactionary space. We're not in a space of loss of words. And I was joking with you earlier, like, I encounter so many white people who struggle to say the word Black.
Yeah.
Like, there's just a lot of stuttering, like, just to say the word Black. So maybe you need to practice in the mirror, just saying it, saying African, whatever it is, just say it. Because I think that what we assume, and myself included, is that we're just going to know how to show up when that moment happens without really thinking about anything else you care about in life. You prepare for yourself. You think about what those moments might be like. You role play. You do whatever is necessary so that when those moments arise, you actually have the wherewithal and you have the muscle memory to be able to respond and react as your authentic self. Because I know quite often what happens is those kind of engagements and those experiences that after the fact, somebody's like, damn, I didn't show up the way I wanted to show up. I wish I had. It didn't. And then there's the email that comes 20 minutes later. Or then there's can we have coffee to talk about it? Because now I want to click. So rather than have to think about the email that you're going to send 20 minutes after that awkward exchange, or the coffee that you're going to want to have, or the lunch, or whatever it is, prepare yourself to be able to really have the facility to navigate the conversations in a meaningful way. That's the work. Mm-hmm. That's the work.
So I'm going to go back to the questions here. Craig asks, what advice would you give to someone who wants to start conversations with friends or family who haven't yet engaged actively with anti-racism?
It's a really good question. I think obviously I need a little bit more context, but I'll start by saying that, there is some element of meeting people at a place of not where they are necessarily, but like meeting people close to where they are, at least to be able to move them up and move them forward, and recognizing that you're probably going to encounter people who have either hostility to what you're trying to share with them, or they might be dismissive of it. And so being sort of strategic, but also being committed to it and modeling it in your own life. Like, so it is one thing where you don't want to like bring people along, but it's another thing when people see your own actions and your own choices in your own life manifesting that. So I would say that it's probably, again, to go back to the work that you would need to do to engage others is often through the model that you're demonstrating for others to be able to see, like, wow, I see this, what he's up to, I see what she's up to, who they're hanging out with, but that becomes more, and then the curiosity can start to emerge on its own. And I find that when people come to it on their own, it's a much healthier kind of exchange that begins to happen versus people feeling they're being proselytized to. People don't like that. People don't like when someone tries to lecture them about something, or when people point out a gap that they might have, because people get defensive around that. So recognizing that you're going to encounter people that are often that are going to be defensive. So therefore, how do you model the things you want to do in a way that doesn't sort of push it on people as the thing that they need to be doing now? But it's just little things slipping. Like, and I'm not just doing I'm not just sort of publicizing my book here, but I do think texts like my own offer some entry points for people, both because I think there's accountability, but there's also sort of empathy, because I think that's a missing component to something. We have sympathy. I see a lot of sympathy often, but I think there's an attempt in here to really grapple with and sort of model some elements of empathy that can be used as a motivating tool, but also as an opening pathway for folks to really know that you're coming to them in a true and authentic way. Those are some of the steps that I would say, and recognize you can't take everybody with you on the journeys that you want to go on. I think that's some of the hard work. I mean, I've even had to do that on my own, with some of my friends. Like, everybody's not going to be on this journey with you, but that doesn't mean your journey is less valid or less important. Right. But what you need to do is find your tribe. Find people that you all can, so whether it's E3, in Northern Michigan, or whether it's, like I'm connected with some white men's groups of people like white allies organizing. Find your tribe, find your people, and don't just think you can do it on your own and do it in isolation, because you need people to hold you accountable, right? You need people to hold you accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question here from Corey. Says, you spoke earlier about the importance of getting your book in the hands of white people in power. I hope you do. There's such power in your words. Do you have any advice or strategies that might help those who feel powerless to gain access to those in power, to help put words in their ears?
Yeah. Organizing, organizing, like, the strength is in the numbers of people. Like, there's so many folks that I think are quietly allies that but because maybe the community they live in or whatever, it might be prohibiting, or there might be just some fear and anxiety around it. So there's organizing, and then there's also a recognition that this work cannot be done without risk. Can't be done without risk. I write about, a James Baldwin quote. He gave a talk to teachers back in the early 60s, and I don't have the quote exactly in front of me, but he says, once you step on this journey, please be aware that you're going to incite a lot of, you're going to incite hostility from people that are close to you potentially. And so the power dynamic, though, I think is one that does require some organizing. It does require some risk taking. And I think, though, at this point in time, we've never had probably a better moment, to be able to challenge power. I mean, power has to be I'm seeing it. I have an opportunity to sit with leaders. They are listening in a way that they've never. They're questioning. They're wondering. They're hungry. So I think some of it also might be in your head too. Like, defining yourself as powerless is also somewhat of a decision. You have to think about how you reorient yourself. Maybe you don't have positional power, but you might have informal authority. And informal authority means that people might follow you. You might be someone who is like identified as the person who is, seen as whatever. Like, so recognize there's formal power, and then there's people who have informal authority and therefore informal power, and they can use that. They can flex that. So don't just situate all attention towards those who hold a position or a role, because people's movements, as we've seen through history, people's movements have demonstrated that power can be it can be disrupted. It reorganizes itself, It always reorganizes itself and finds new iterations, right? We got to be clear about that. It doesn't just decide, you don't just get a victory one day and then it's all done. No, that's not how power operates, especially power that's operating as a means to oppress. That's not going to stop. We've seen iterations of what we're watching and witnessing right now with critical race, that we've seen iterations of that throughout our history. That is not a new thing. It is how power operates to maintain a status quo. It galvanizes white resentment when it's necessary, and then it dismisses white folks who are not of means and of power when it no longer needs it, right? So what I'm getting at is, understand that those who have power and who are using it in an oppressive manner, they are very clear about how to organize and who to organize and what messages to send the people that they want, what dog whistles to use to get people organized, right? What I say to my white folks who are listening right now is be very cognizant of the messages that you're hearing from some of this punditry out here around whatever critical race theory is, what it's trying to do in schools. Like, be clear that there's that is a strategy that has been used it was political correctness in the 1990s, and I write about it in the book. It was back in the 60s. These are the same folks who back in the 60s were like, we're not going to integrate schools. So it's a part of a same family of maintaining a certain, a very clear, white supremacist regime in our country. And they use other white folks who are, maybe not thinking about these issues in a broad on a day. They use them when necessary. They galvanize resentment when it's appropriate, and when they would like to shut down conversations or enforce the will that they want to have executed or enacted. So just be clear, like there are people behind this effort that are intentionally trying to organize resentment because they know how to get at resentment. They know how to get at white resentment very well.
Thank you for bringing that up. Right now, we are struggling in this school district with critical race theory, and there's a lot of board meetings that are happening right now on resolutions and the inclusion of critical race theory. And what is coming up in these board conversations is that some folks feel that critical race theory is divisive and that it is indoctrinating students, which I find to be a very interesting word choice to use in these conversations about school. I wonder your thoughts on that.
I mean, so you're speaking to the kid who was the Black kid in the class that we didn't talk about race. So as I tell people, so when we're reading The Great Gatsby, or we're reading Othello, or reading these books in which race is a subtext and racism is very subtext, and therefore I'm sitting there, I'm also in the classroom as well, and I am not being nourished. I am not getting anything. So now the anxiety and stress and all this uproar is only for your children. Where was this for me? Why did no one care when I was not getting nourished with what I needed to have so that I could have a strong sense of self? You were totally okay with me being, walking around having questions about why all the books we're reading and all the things we're engaging with textually, either telling me a story of how I was a slave and that's all I was, or telling me this. Why is that okay? Right? So I just would challenge folks to think about, there's a certain hypocrisy here where you're totally fine with a certain kind of education that leaves out information that is vital for the development of all young people. If there is any threat whatsoever, which I don't even think is a legitimate threat, to be quite honest, that your young people might develop some sensibility about the world that might be a little bit different than your own. But what we saw last year and what we're seeing right now is that people, and that's what I experienced on all those phone calls and people who are, is that people are going to come to these awakenings later. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want them to have a structured environment where they can learn about our history from teachers who are trained to educate and whose intention is to educate all children and is not to indoctrinate young people, it is to educate all children about facts of history? Or would you rather them figure it out when they're 30 years old or 40 years old, and then they're angry for why did my parents never tell me this? Why did people? Because they're going to find it out. the truth will start to emerge. And so I would rather engage with this stuff in some meaningful way in an educational environment. And it is not, and it really pains me to hear that this is about, in many ways shaming white kids and making white kids. That's not the work that I do in the world.
No.
That's not in any way what I'm up to, or the people I work with are up to. And so that sort of the twisting of our work, the twisting it into this sort of narrative of divisiveness is really hard to hear, because I'm like, that's not at all what I'm up to. And I hope people can interact with me for an hour and know that that's not what this person is trying to do. And it's not and I represent many people who are doing various types of this work in the world. What we're trying to do is we're trying to bring a truer, more authentic history of our experience in this country into our lives at a younger age, so that we don't have to come to these realizations later on. And this dog whistle, this term critical race theory, it's just a fascinating idea that a year ago nobody had heard of it.
Right.
I just ask people, like, how can something you didn't know about a year ago become something that has caused so much hostility? I need you to sit with that. Why is this making your heart beat faster? Why are you getting palpitations over something like this? You didn't have these feelings when you saw people getting murdered. Why do you have these palpitations? Like, what does that say about you? That says you have been racialized. Right. That says that racism is harming you too, because you will tell me all day long, I'm an individual. Don't talk to me as, but I don't identify as a white person. But as soon as white issue, or the issue of white people being marginalized or having to, or experience sort of an education in which there is a more holistic view, there's this now people identify as white again. So I just want, and I offer that as it's just data. It's important to recognize, where do you find yourself getting defensive? What is the trigger there? Is it this notion that Black people are getting ahead and getting too much, or there's too much attention on Black people right now? Let's look at the data. Like, look at who's dying of COVID. Like, look at who's in poverty. Like, we are not, like, this idea of the too much attention or too much focus is just, it's baffling to me. It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. Like, let's look at the real data out here and talk about, like, is that actually a factual statement, or are you just feeling something different than you ever felt before? And that's not a bad thing, maybe. Oh, Courtney, you with us? Lost Courtney for a second. I'm still here though. Okay, I'm about to go to questions here. So there's a question, I'm gonna go for it right here. Do I feel hopeful about progress and social justice in this country? This is a question from Linda. Yes, I do. I absolutely do. Because if I tell you a story about my father's experience, or my grandfather's experience, or my grandmother's experience, or my mother's experience, and if I were to sit here and say, well, Dax can have this conversation with a predominantly white audience, presumably, I might be wrong, presumably, but predominantly white audience, and he can have the latitude and space to talk like this and to do the work he's doing in the world, for people to buy the book, people to, and I know that's an individual experience, but I also know that it's an experience that's being mirrored by a lot of folks in this world. So I am absolutely a believer that there are things, dramatic changes that have happened, and to dismiss the changes that have happened would be, I think, disingenuous, and it would actually be a slap in the face of my ancestors. Do we have more work to do? Absolutely. But yeah, would the letters to white women be different? This is from Susan. That's a really good question. I made sure to write to an audience that I felt like I have access to and have a relationship with. And I have a relationship with, I have access to a relationship with white women as well. Absolutely. And I hope that they understand and see themselves in this book too. I just made a decision in this context because it was an organic project for me. This wasn't one that I didn't sit down a year ago, like, I'm about to write a book. This was a letter I wrote organically to a group of my friends that then began to take on a bit of a life of its own, which called me to feel like there was a deeper work to be done in that community with that group of people. So, I think that this book still speaks to a lot of different people, white women included. So that's my answer right here. I'm gonna take a couple more questions, and And who's going to jump in? Come on, is that Carl? You going to jump in? Somebody want to jump in? I'm going to take one more question, and I appreciate all of these, and I would totally want to, if you want to email and respond to them, I'm like, absolutely. Okay. So there's a question. I would appreciate concrete examples of how white people are harmed by systemic racism that permeates our country. Yes, the students at UNC will be deprived of learning from Nicole Handges, but how else are white people harmed? I would like some help persuading a few folks in my life. It's a great question. And again, I'm going to also point you to sort of look at and connect with the book. I get at like what I might call inchoate harms that I think when I've been talking about this idea of disbelief, I think is a harm. And it's a harm because it means it's really underneath that is this sense that I can hear the experiences of Black people, but I still don't actually believe that what they're saying is an authentic representation of reality. And to me, that is an example of an incredibly harmful belief that I don't say everybody is holding, but it manifests itself in our criminal justice system. It manifests itself in the employment if I look at a lot of the workplaces that I work with, there's sort of this inherent belief or disbelief that there is something systemic going on in the ways in which we've made decisions. And I think that is a problem. And I think that is a real harm insofar as it kind of gives a very warped sense of both the reality that we share and a warped sense of how sort of, and I think it's very deeply connected with how white supremacy kind of operates in these sort of very normalized ways that go unquestioned and unchallenged. And so I go back to this idea of like getting at these inchoate, not necessarily, there are concrete ones, we could talk about deprivation of specific experiences, but I want to get at some of the emotional things and the kind of psychological and mental and sort of even physiological ways in which the harm manifests itself. But I'm kind of talking generally at the end of a conversation. I would definitely encourage you to look at the 3 chapters that I write in sort of the middle section of the book, the healing section, because I get at those in some really specific ways to help people maybe understand how they might be manifesting in themselves, and they can connect back with others around that. But again, I appreciate these questions. I appreciate everybody taking the time to be here to listen. And I wish I could get to all of them. And I do hope folks get a chance to engage with the book. And when you have a chance to do so, come back to me, email me. I tend to get back to people. But thanks so much for this time. I really appreciate it.
And Dax, this is Jillian Manning here. Courtney was working so hard to get everything back up and running, and one day we'll have you back here in person so that when nothing can go wrong on stage, right? We can make it all work. But thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. We're so grateful to have had you. And everybody, I recommend going out and reading the book, and it'll really speak to so many people in so many different ways. So thank you, Dax, for your time. We so appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope you'll all continue the conversation by purchasing a copy of Letters to My White Male Friends from your favorite independent bookstore. Thank you again to our donors and major supporters: Cordia, Forefront Credit Union, the Northwest Michigan Arts and Culture Network, our sponsor, Rare Bird Brew Pub, Interlochen Public Radio, and the Traverse City Record Eagle. This event is also made possible in part by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. And thank you to you, our viewers. Your support makes all the difference, and the proceeds from our events go to our Raising Writers programs to help spread the love of reading and writing. Thank you, and good night.